The first time I realized my life was no longer mine was at the funeral. People whispered in corners, not about grief or the man in the coffin, but about numbers, percentages, property deeds. It wasn't mourning, it was an auction house dressed in black. And in the middle of it stood my mother, her face a mask of widowhood, while her eyes counted the empire my father had left behind. The inheritance should have been a legacy. My father's business, his blood and bones poured into years of sweat and missed dinners, was meant to provide security, stability. Instead, it became a battlefield. My unemployed sister clung to my mother's arm, both of them whispering, calculating, rehearsing the story they would soon tell to lawyers and strangers in robes. 80%. That was the number they wanted to carve out of me, as if my existence was the mistake that had cheated them. I tried to remind myself of the old days when the business smelled of freshly printed contracts and polished wooden desks, when employees smiled because my father's word meant protection. But every memory was tainted now. Each recollection bent itself into a question. Had it all been for nothing if those closest to him could turn his name into a weapon? The first letter came 2 weeks later. Thick envelope, heavy paper, the kind that announces ruin before you even slit it open. Legal jargon spilled across the page like a disease. Claims of embezzlement, accusations that I had squandered assets. My sister's name, my mother's signature. Bloodlines inked in black, severed on white. I wanted to laugh, but laughter caught in my throat like a swallowed blade. They accused me of draining the accounts, of burying funds in secret places. They didn't just want money, they wanted my father's reputation dragged through dirt, his empire painted as a fraud that only I had orchestrated. I was no longer a son or a brother. I was the villain in a courtroom drama they had scripted without me. The horror wasn't just in the betrayal. It was in the shadows that came with it. At night, I began to hear sounds in the office, an office I now kept locked and empty. Papers rustling when no wind passed through. The faint clink of a pen dropping onto a desk I hadn't touched in hours. Once I returned after midnight to retrieve documents for my lawyer, and the lights were already on. The smell was unmistakable, my father's cologne, lingering as if he had just stepped out of the room. I stood frozen at the doorway, waiting for his voice, the old bark of command he used when an employee tried to cut corners. But silence pressed against me, thick as wool. The papers on the desk were scattered, as though someone had rifled through them with desperate hands. My name appeared scribbled again and again on an abandoned legal pad in handwriting that looked almost like his. Almost, but not quite. The lawsuits dragged on like chains tied to my ankles. Each hearing chipped away at my defenses. Each new accusation carved deeper into the narrative they were building. The prodigal son who squandered his father's empire. And with every blow, I felt reality tilting. Not just in the courtroom, but in the spaces I once considered my own. The house became unlivable. Every night was marked by disturbances that made sleep impossible. Sometimes it was footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Other times it was the voice of my father, faint, muffled as though speaking through water. I would stumble out of bed, heart hammering, only to find the air thick and heavy, charged with something that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was exhaustion, that paranoia was the natural byproduct of grief and betrayal. But then came the mirror. One morning, as I dressed for yet another court session, I noticed a smudge on the bathroom mirror. I leaned in to wipe it away, but the reflection that stared back at me was wrong. The suit was the same, the tired eyes, the clenched jaw. But behind my reflection stood my mother and sister, their faces twisted, stretched into grotesque versions of themselves. My mother's lips curled upward in a smile too wide to be human, while my sister's eyes were black pits that swallowed the light. I blinked, and the image vanished. The mirror showed only me again, but the tremor in my hands didn't fade. That day in court, I could hardly hear the judge over the echo of their distorted faces. The horror was no longer confined to my home. It seeped into the business, too, what little of it remained. Files vanished from locked cabinets. Client accounts glitched with numbers that made no sense. Balances drained to zero, then reappearing hours later. Emails sent themselves to addresses I didn't recognize. I would sit at the desk, staring at screens flickering with half-written messages. He knows, he knows, he knows. I changed passwords, replaced hardware, even hired a technician to sweep for malware. The report came back clean, but the malfunctions continued. That was when I realized it wasn't code. It wasn't theft. It was infestation. Something had bled into the circuits of the business, something hungry, wearing my father's scent. The lawsuits fed it. The louder my mother and sister shouted about my supposed embezzlement, the stronger the manifestations became. Doors slammed shut behind me. Files were rearranged in patterns I couldn't understand. Once, I found the word thief carved into the wooden surface of my father's old desk, deep grooves, as though gouged by nails.
Stress does strange things. That's what I told myself. Even as sleep abandoned me, even as the whispers from my mother and sister crept deeper into my ears than any nightmare. They wanted 80%. But with every passing day, I feared the number wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about identity. They wanted to take 80% of who I was, leave me hollow, a shell carrying accusations no one would ever forget. Court filings turned into media whispers. Headlines dripped with suspicion. Son accused of embezzlement in family fortune scandal. Former business partners avoided my calls. Employees left one by one, their loyalty eroded by doubt. The office, once buzzing with the pulse of ambition, was a mausoleum now, a quiet place where dust settled on unanswered phones and my father's portrait glared at me from the wall. Sometimes I caught myself asking him aloud, "Did I fail you, or did you fail me by leaving me with them?" No answer ever came, but the shadows in the corners seemed to swell, as though silence itself was growing teeth. I should have fought harder in those first weeks, hired better lawyers, slammed back with countersuits, shouted until the world believed me. But grief is a parasite. It eats your willpower, drains your defenses. And while I mourned, they built their case. My sister, unemployed for years, suddenly spoke like a financial analyst, parroting words from advisors she had no means to hire on her own. My mother played the victim perfectly, weeping for cameras, telling anyone who would listen that her son had betrayed her late husband's trust. The betrayal festered in more than just legal documents. My home no longer felt safe. Calls at odd hours, the line going dead as soon as I answered, shadows that lingered a second too long in my peripheral vision. Once I woke at 3 a.m. to find every cabinet in my kitchen opened wide, as though someone had searched for something invisible. The air smelled faintly of smoke, charred paper, like contracts burning. When I told my lawyer, he offered a tired smile and said, "Stress does that." But I knew better. Stress doesn't scatter papers in locked offices. Stress doesn't scratch words into walls. Because by then, I had seen it. One night, the lights flickered, and for a heartbeat too long, my father stood there. Or something shaped like him. His suit hung as though soaked, his face pale and caved in at the cheeks. He pointed at me with a trembling hand, and when I tried to move, the floor beneath me moaned as if it would crack open. Then the lights steadied, and I was alone again. Alone with the accusations, the lawsuits, and a family that had turned me into a monster. But the true horror was this. Maybe they weren't entirely wrong. Maybe the shadows knew something about me I refused to admit.
The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. For the first time, I saw doubt, not just in the eyes of strangers, but in the law itself. My father's empire was slipping further from my hands, guided not only by betrayal, but by something older, colder, crawling beneath the floorboards of our lives. After that day, the boundaries fully collapsed. Shadows didn't wait for night anymore. They followed me under daylight. Street reflections twisted, shop windows showing me as a hollow-eyed stranger. Cars slowed when they passed, drivers staring too long, their faces blurred, mouths repeating silent words. Thief, thief, thief. I began to wonder if my mother and sister had conjured this themselves. Not consciously, maybe, but their greed was fertile ground. They wanted my father's wealth, his legacy, his power. And perhaps something in this world, something that feeds on bloodline hatred, had answered them. The house gave me no peace. My father's study grew colder each night until frost bloomed across the windows, though summer blazed outside. The chair still creaked when unseen weight pressed against it. I once found the desk drawer open, papers scattered, only to see my own handwriting across contracts, words I never wrote, funds diverted, assets hidden, evidence erased. It was building a case against me without my help, a spectral prosecution drafting confessions in the dark. The breaking point came one storm-heavy evening. I returned from another fruitless legal meeting to find the house blacked out again. The air reeked of wet soil, as though the walls had been dug out of a grave. Lightning flashed, illuminating the living room, and for the briefest instant I saw them, my mother and sister, seated together on the couch, smiling. Their skin was pale, translucent, and their mouths opened too wide. When thunder rolled, the vision vanished, but a sound remained. Laughter, faint and echoing from the walls. I ran to the study, candle in hand, determined to burn the cursed will. But when I opened the desk, it wasn't the will I found. It was photographs again, this time not slashed, but altered. My father's face was blurred away entirely. My mother's smile stretched unnaturally wide. My sister's eyes glowed faintly red. And my own image? Absent. Cut clean out of the frame, leaving only jagged edges. The candle trembled. Wax dripped on my hand, but I barely felt it. The silence thickened until it pressed into my ears, and then a voice broke it. Not my father's voice, not my mother's. Something deeper, something that slithered through syllables. You are guilty.
But what chilled me most was how quickly the world believed them. Journalists camped outside the courthouse, scribbling half-truths into stories that sold better than facts. Former friends avoided eye contact. Even distant relatives sent cold, clipped messages. If you did it, confess. Don't shame the family further. The horror wasn't just spectral, it was societal. My own blood had painted me guilty, and the world preferred their version. One evening, after another day spent choking on legal arguments, I returned home to find the front door ajar. My stomach tightened. I knew I had locked it that morning. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth. On the living room table lay a stack of family photographs, each one slashed across the faces with a blade. My father's face, my mother's, even mine, all mutilated. But one photo remained untouched. My sister, smiling broadly, frozen in time. I burned the photographs in the fireplace, watching the edges curl into ash. But even as the flames consumed them, I swore I heard laughter echoing from the walls. The more I resisted, the more the boundaries blurred. In dreams, I saw my father sitting at his desk, only this time his features were missing. No eyes, no mouth, just skin stretched tight across his skull. He would beckon me closer, and when I hesitated, the silence would break with a whisper that wasn't his. 80%, 80%. 80%. The number chased me into waking hours, on receipts, on computer screens, even on the faces of clocks where hands froze at 8 o'clock, as if time itself mocked me. 80% wasn't just their legal demand anymore, it was a curse. A percentage of my soul that was being stripped away piece by piece. I tried confiding in my lawyer. He nodded politely, scribbled notes, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. To him, I was another desperate client cracking under pressure, and maybe I was. But when he left that evening, I found his notepad on the desk. My stomach lurched as I read the final line he had written. Client shows signs of paranoia, possibly unstable. Consider psychiatric evaluation. Even the one person meant to defend me was preparing to declare me unfit. The isolation was complete now. My home was hostile, my business infected, the courts poisoned, and in that isolation something darker emerged. Shadows didn't just watch anymore, they moved with purpose. Doors didn't just close, they locked. I became a prisoner in my own spaces. Every escape attempt met with resistance from forces I couldn't name. One night, the power cut out. I lit a candle, its flames shivering as though terrified. The silence was suffocating until I heard it. The dragging of feet across the floor above me, my father's study. I forced myself upstairs, each step creaking under the weight of dread. When I pushed the door open, the room was empty, except for the desk.
On it lay the will, the original document, the one lawyers had spent weeks dissecting. Only now, the numbers were different. Not 50-50, not fair distribution. The page declared in ink too fresh to be decades old. 80% to my wife and daughter, 20% to my son, provided he proves worthy. My father's signature sprawled across the bottom. I stumbled back, heart pounding. I had seen the will before. This was not it. Yet here it was, smelling of fresh ink, mocking my memory. And in the silence that followed, the chair behind a desk creaked, as if someone invisible had leaned back into it. I fled the room, but even as I slammed the door, the whisper followed me down the hall. Prove worthy, or lose everything. The will haunted me, not just as paper, not just as words written in a hand I recognized, but knew didn't belong here. It was a curse that lingered even when I shut my eyes. I dreamed of that signature glowing faintly in the dark, bleeding ink until the whole page turned black. And when I woke, my hands were stained as if I had been the one writing all night long. I tried to dismiss it as hallucination, some trick of exhaustion, but the next court session confirmed otherwise. My mother's lawyer, with the kind of smugness only money can buy, slid a copy of the very same altered will across the table. Recently discovered, he claimed, proof that our client is entitled to 80%. My blood froze. I looked at my lawyer, expecting disbelief, objection, something, but he only frowned, as if trying to recall whether this had always been the case. The courtroom spun around me. I wanted to shout that it wasn't real, that it had changed overnight, that the house itself had forged the document, but my throat betrayed me. My words shriveled before they left my lips.
I shouted, tore them down, tried to set them aflame. But fire refused to catch. The ink resisted, smoldering without burning. That was when I understood. This wasn't meant to be destroyed. It was meant to be endured. The trial reached its climax soon after. My mother testified with trembling hands, speaking of betrayal, of lost trust, of the empire she claimed I had poisoned. My sister wept, claiming I had shut her out, left her with nothing. Every word they spoke bent truth into grotesque shapes, yet the courtroom devoured it, nodding along. When it was my turn to speak, I opened my mouth, and nothing came. Not one word. My throat locked, paralyzed. My lawyer stared at me, panicked, but all I could do was sit there, silent, because behind the judge, in the shadows of the courtroom, I saw him. My father, or what was left of him, hollow eyes, mouth sealed shut, his suit dripping with shadows. He raised a hand, pointed at me, and the walls whispered again, 80%, 80%, 80%. The gavel struck. The ruling was clear. 80% to them, 20% to me, conditional, under supervision. The empire was gone. The legacy dissolved into ash. I left the courthouse to a storm that hadn't broken all day. Rain lashed against my face, but I hardly noticed. For the first time I felt weightless, not from relief, but from loss so total it hollowed me out. At home, the lights refused to turn on. I walked through darkness, guided only by memory. The study door was open, though I had shut it that morning. Inside the desk waited. On it lay a single page. Not the will, not a contract, a mirror. Framed in my father's handwriting, the reflection showed me seated at the desk, ink staining my fingers, a smile twisting my face that I did not wear. Behind me, my mother and sister leaned close, their eyes black, their mouth whispering endlessly, "Thief, thief, thief." The reflection raised its pen, poised to sign, and though I dropped the candle, though I turned away, I felt the scratch of ink etching into my very skin. I don't know if I ever left that study. Some days I wake in strange places, legal documents around me, signatures bearing my name, though I never held a pen. Other days I swear I hear the business phones ringing, though the office is long closed. Maybe they won. Maybe I lost. Or maybe I became the proof they needed. Because when I catch my reflection now, it no longer hesitates. It signs without me. And in its eyes I see 80% gone, 20% fading fast.